Hello, and thanks for joining today's webinar by Real Story Group. This is Scott Dill, and I'm on the business development team here. Our founder and CEO, Tony Byrne, will be on the line momentarily to take us through the meat of today's presentation. But I just wanted to kick things off with a couple housekeeping items of note here as we get started. First and foremost, we will have time for questions and feedback at the end. So if you do have questions at any point during today's session or want to provide your own comments, you can do so in the questions tab and then go to webinar control panel, and we'll try to answer as many as we can as we wrap things up. Also, you will be able to access these slides over the next couple of days. Those will be made available to all the attendees. And then I do see a number of subscribers on the line as well. And so as a subscriber, you'll be able to access a recording of today's presentation in your subscriber library. So again, thanks. Today we're going to focus on when big MarTech vendors break bad. Certainly a passionate topic for us. I know Tony is very excited to deliver this presentation. And as we get started, we take a look at the vendors that we actually cover within our research, and you'll notice that in the middle of our subway map are a number of those platform or suite vendors. So we're going to be focusing on a number of topics as it pertains to those bigger vendors today, and where are some areas that they can improve, and what are some important areas that you should be focusing on as a MarTech stack owner and or a technology buyer. So you'll see here in the map that we do cover a number of these different areas within our research. There are a few different ways that you can leverage our insight through our research subscription offerings, and as well as a omni-channel tech stack executive council. We'll be meeting next week, and if that's something that's of interest to you, inquire after today's presentation, and we can talk to you more about that. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Tony to take us through today's presentation. Tony? Like Tony's muted. Tony, just need to unmute and you'll be ready to go.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Scott. I founded the company 20 years ago based on a quadrant sort of like this, that I was working at an implementation firm. We were implementing tools that were in the top sort of right-hand quadrant, having a lot of problems with them that weren't really uncovered in traditional analyst reports. I thought to myself, there's got to be a better way to tell the story about how these tools really work. And we decided that the only way to do that was to serve as, really as tough critics in this marketplace. And so as a result, we're really the only major analyst firm in the world that doesn't advise or consult with vendors. We only work with you, the actual licensee or the end user customer, helping you make really good decisions. So this is really an interesting topic. I mean, I think it's easy to be too one-sided about it. And so I'll just start out by saying that, good and bad can coexist in this world. Certainly in terms of Walter Wright, he started out as a good guy, but clearly he had his flaws. He was living already kind of a deceptive life. And then towards the end, when he's really a hardened criminal and murderer, he also had a conscience and maybe some redeeming qualities. And so let's just say that about all of us, and including the vendors that I'll talk about today too. There's kind of good sides and bad sides to them. I think that sometimes, though, particularly among some of the larger vendors, they do have a tendency to break bad, and you need to be aware of that and really kind of protect yourself in that sort of environment. So the first area I think that causes a lot of confusion and consternation, particularly for those of you who really care about how the technology actually works, is this whole notion of these sort of MarTech and customer experience clouds, these ideas that across all these different products, which are constantly getting renamed and reshuffled, that there's some, coherence across this. And the reality, of course, is, that a lot of these are really acquired tools, and that often target different sorts of marketplaces, different tiers of customers, overlapping use cases, certainly different architectures underneath the hood. And so, you need to be careful already that when the vendor is telling a sort of expansive story about what they can do with you, there's a lot of details hidden underneath there that can be critically important for your success. So the first area where these vendors tend to break bad is by kind of overstating the breadth, the capabilities, the degree of integration, and I would say the overall coherence of their different suites and clouds when taken together. As Scott mentioned, there's a set of vendors who can claim more or less that we can do it all or almost all. And so, I mentioned on the previous slide, Oracle, Adobe, Acoustic, which is the inheritor of most of the IBM MarTech stack, and Salesforce. To a lesser extent, Microsoft and SAP could be thrown into this mix as well. There are other bit players, like Sitecore and others who might want to sort of venture into this space. But it's this idea that, because we have all these different stops on these subway lines, that we can solve all of your problems. And on the one hand, this is a very appealing concept. On the other hand, there's obvious issues for you if you care about how to actually implement and be successful with these tools. So the first thing to recognize is that even though a vendor may sell multiple different tools, and even though an analyst firm may say that describe these as a single platform, these are not single platforms. So a good example is this firm that was made up by analyst firms, this term, digital experience platform, or DXP. And the implication is that this is somehow a stack in the box where the vendor is going to supply you e-commerce, personalization, web content management, digital asset management, email marketing, CRM, and all these other services. And the reality is this doesn't actually exist. For sure, digital experience is a really important practice and discipline and something to pursue. We all want to improve digital experiences for our customers. But this notion that a DXP or a single platform exists that can give you this is a complete fantasy. And so here you need to be very careful about analyst firms sort of aligning with the worst tendencies among these vendors to suggest that they have single solutions for what are really multidimensional problems, particularly if you're a larger enterprise. This kind of stack in the box might work, for some smaller mid-sized enterprises where, I might get a smaller mid-market solution like a HubSpot, have it do a number of things for me, and that works. But if you're a large enterprise, you need to think about these things a little bit more in terms of your overall service design. Now, I understand why marketers and customer experience people in particular, why this kind of story is attractive to them, because we're all dealing with the silo problem, right? We've been modernizing our different silos all through the last 10 years. And the issue is that each particular engagement silo typically comes in a highly vertically coupled environment where it may have its own content, its own data, its own rules, its own planning subsystems, and then ultimately perhaps its own analytics subsystem. And so trying to integrate all these things in a way that I can have a consistent customer experience is exceptionally difficult. And we're all trying to do this with sort of peer-to-peer integration, and it's not really scaling. And so this is why it's a kind of a tempting escape. Maybe if I just get it all from the same vendor, this will solve it for me. I'm going to suggest an alternative approach, and that is to look at this more from a services perspective, that you think about breaking out or abstracting, decoupling these core foundation services. So in green, around omni-channel operations, in orange, almost table stakes these days, having some unified customer data. In purple, journey orchestration and decisioning for omni-channel personalization and next best actions. Omni-channel content in red, that's kind of an emerging technology space and practice. And then certainly, maybe the most mature area here is around customer intelligence, analytics, reporting, and modeling. So the idea here is that you should look at these services that can work across your whole stack, underneath your whole stack, disconnected from specific engagement silos where otherwise those services kind of get trapped. And so this is the way to try to unify your stack rather than just going exclusively with a single vendor. So this is a services model. Now let's take a look at what this looks like from a systems reference architecture. And again, these are reference architectures for what we believe will be the omni-channel decade of 2020s. And so these are aspirational. We don't know any single firm that's totally gotten here, but it's certainly, we think, a useful target model to sort of play with. And here again, you see some of the key capabilities, but this time reflected as specific technology platforms. So these are things that you might go out into the marketplace and buy. Everything from the interaction and delivery environments down through the content and engagement management platforms in the first colored area, and then the enterprise foundation platforms below. So this is nominally a coherent stack, but things are layered in this stack on purpose. The challenge comes, of course, when you have a vendor like Salesforce that says, I can do a lot of these things. Now, to be sure, you might have to license several dozen different Salesforce products to get there, but Salesforce will say, look, I can sell you all of these things. And they're also going to tell you, although it's, as you know, it's not very true, they're going to tell you that these pieces are all very integrated. So this is for sure a compelling story for them to tell the marketplace. The question that comes to mind is, just because you're using Salesforce for service and support and it's working well for you, that doesn't necessarily mean that Salesforce is going to work for you in terms of an intelligence hub or in terms of an e-commerce platform, or certainly almost surely not in terms of a web content management system, even though nominally Salesforce sells these things. And you probably know that these are also built on different platforms, with different architectures, different user experience models, so on and so forth. So the fact that they all come from Salesforce doesn't mean that there's necessarily anything unifying about them. So the way that this actually plays out, we've been having an abstract discussion from kind of an architectural perspective, and hopefully I'm planting some seeds of doubt in your mind about going with a single vendor for a number of these things. But let's look at this really where it matters, which is the actual marketer. So let's say you're a marketer, and every Friday you have to drill a small hole in a piece of wood. That's what you're going to do every Friday. Now, someone might pop up and say, well, we already have a vendor who can drill that hole for us. And the marketer says, great. And the person comes out and says, well, here it is. It's this massive drill press. It'll work. Technically, it'll work. But is that marketer actually going to be happy? Are they going to be agile? Are they going to be able to do this regularly on Friday? And someone might say, well, that's great. That's a muscle building activity. But if I'm doing this at work as opposed to as a hobby, surely this is the wrong tool for the job. And so that's one of the big risks, of course, about a vendor cross-selling you, is that because they've acquired these tools very differently, they often have very different target use cases. Like one might be oriented towards B2B, the other to B2C, one towards a very mature operating environment, one towards a more outsourced and thinner operating environment. And so just the fact that a vendor can sell you this drill press doesn't mean that it's actually going to work for you on Friday when you need to drill that very tiny hole in a piece of wood. So what we're really talking about here is fitness to purpose. So how do you address that? That's gonna spend the next sort of half of this time together talking about how to deal with these sorts of issues. Now, I'll remind you once again that you can feel free to ask questions in the GoToWebinar control panel. We'll have time at the end. You can ask questions, share your own experiences. If there's anything you disagree with, feel free to chime in on anything at all, and we'll definitely have time to address it. Okay, so the term of the day here is design thinking. And we ended up actually writing a book about this, which we called The Right Way to Select Technology, my colleague Jared and I, to try to incorporate design thinking into what had traditionally been very waterfall type approaches to selecting technology, which is you spend a lot of time getting the perfect requirements, put it down on paper, and then go have a single demo and then select the tool. This model is much more team-based. It's very test-based and empirical. You iterate and adapt your requirements as you learn. So the useful thing about this is you can apply this technology section as well as stack assessments, right? So if you do put a team together, put some test case together, and then kind of adapt as you can do that, you can see which tools might be play the right role, particularly provide the right services or capabilities in your stack, maybe even among your pre-existing set. So probably from design thinking that it has various flavors, various, I would say, different stages. First, you empathize by creating user stories. This is critically important. Without these, from a MarTech perspective, really you're lost. Fortunately, many of you who are marketers already know how to do this. You just haven't always turned this on your own systems. Then you define your needs through an RFP and a vendor shortlist. You ideate through vendor proposals and demos, and then always, always, always prototype through some kind of hands-on bake-off. I'm dumbfounded how many firms don't pick technology without actually testing it. And this happens a lot with your major incumbent vendors. So again, I'm talking about Salesforce, Oracle, Adobe, Acoustic, IBM, to a lesser extent, Microsoft, SAP, and others. But because you already know the vendor, you think you're going to know the tool. And so they sell it to you, yeah, I'll buy it, right? Without actually testing it. You really always, always, always want to do hands-on testing. It's like trying to buy a luxury car and all you're doing is watching the salesperson drive it around the parking lot. No. Get in the car, turn on the ignition, drive it around in your neighborhood, take it to work, see how it actually works for you. Always, always, always. And I can't overstate the importance of use cases here. So here's 10 potential CDP business use case categories. This is what we use when we're evaluating CDP vendors, is their fit against these different use cases. This is the same methodology we use for other marketplaces like web content management, marketing automation, so on and so forth. We take standard use cases and then we match them up against the vendors. One of the interesting things that we learned about this is typically a vendor is only going to support 3 or 4 use cases very well, maybe on a couple more okay, and then 2 to 3 they don't really target hardly at all, maybe intentionally, and maybe that's a good thing. So the key thing is to really prioritize your business use cases. So this is the opposite of saying, okay, I already have this relationship with Adobe. I know I need a DAM. Let's just use the Adobe DAM. Instead, what you say, or for that matter, CDP. Instead, what you say is, what are my DAM use cases? What are my CDP use cases? What's the best match against those particular use cases? Now, there are some benefits certainly to incumbency. The thing is that you need to look at those in a more relative way rather than an absolute way. So here's a way to do that. When we're recommending shortlists to our subscribers or we're helping them select technology, oftentimes we come down to some sort of a chart like this that says, look, with these first let's prioritize our business objectives. So that's what you have in the rows here. You have a new MarTech platform. And I've got 4 marketing use cases, but then there's 4 things I also want to do. I might want to integrate effectively with our CDP. I might want a business-friendly platform management. I do want a productive relationship with a solid vendor supplier, right? And I want to realize attractive TCO. And then I've got these 4 use cases, right? So those are the 8 rows. Notice that my 2 primary use cases are 1 and 2. Then I'm prioritizing 3 or 4 a little bit later, and I'm acknowledging that there's other things that might outweigh that use case in terms of my thinking of how I'm going to then rate these vendors. Then over on the right, you've got vendor rating. So this might be around building a short list, or maybe you've already gone through demos. Let's say you had 5 rounds of demos. You have to narrow down from 5 to 2. So you've got 4 vendors who may be new to your stack, and then the 5th vendor who's an incumbent who says, look, I already have a relationship with you, so you should consider me. It's like, well, okay, fine, we'll consider you. But you'll also note that this is a very logical, structured way of showing why they're a poor fit. So when someone comes back and says, well, we want a productive relationship with a solid vendor supplier, and we want a vendor that can integrate effectively with our CDP. And maybe this incumbent vendor is your CDP provider, right? So that's not a bad thing. But you need to see that in context of your other business objectives, right? So this is a way of taking these kind of broad and vague statements like, oh, if I buy it from acoustic, and I've got these other acoustic tools, it's going to be better integrated, it's going to be cheaper, I already have a good relationship. Oh yeah, okay, I'll take all of those things, but let's also weigh those against the other business objectives that we have for this new platform and put it in context. And then you can bring this to executives and say, okay, this is why we didn't go with the incumbent vendor who we already have in our stack, because we prioritize our business objectives, and on some of the really important ones, 1, 2, and 4, it just was not there. Right? So this was not going to be a good business fit for us. It's a very structural way of sort of pushing back when the relationship is being over leveraged. The reality is we're seeing a lot of relationship over leveraging right now, particularly among major vendors. And what we're hearing is time and again from our major subscribers, and I think Scott told you we work primarily with larger enterprises. We work a lot with the MarTech leaders of those enterprises. They all have, almost all of them have relationships, variety of relationships with Oracle, Salesforce, Adobe, Microsoft, former IBM stack. What a lot of them are telling us is that their relationships with these have gone from consultative to transactional. So this is happening to you as well. You're not alone. Some of the key signs here is when the vendor starts exhibiting share of stack behavior. So this is a way of them saying, you know, all right, you already use this for marketing automation. Now you want a CDP. You need to buy my CDP, right? Because not necessarily that I'm going to charge you a lot of money for it, but it's really important for me to own more of your stack. It seems to be almost a kind of KPI that has drawn some attention on Wall Street. And so that's unfortunate because it makes it very immutable for you. But this also sometimes leads to some bullying and selling up the chain. And we've heard some awful examples of it. Some of those examples have been cataloged in this blog post that my colleague Jared wrote that you can see the link to on the bottom. But things like, you know, someone from a vendor going and taking an executive to lunch or having them for a special community event and saying, look, your team that's that's selecting these tools, they're not thinking strategically, they're thinking too tactically. If you work with us, I'll simplify all of your problems, we'll simplify your stack, all your integration issues will go away. It's a really awful thing to do, to go behind the back of a team, particularly if it's a healthy team following the methodologies that we subscribe to here around putting together an interdisciplinary, multi-department team, working through an agile process, prioritizing your business objectives, and then have someone swoop in to your executive and tell you that that team's making a decision that's not in the best interest of the enterprise. It's a truly awful thing to do, but vendors are doing it. So you need to be forewarned is forearmed here. We also see account executives selling more than advising, and I think that's just a byproduct of this. And the customer events, which are increasingly large and often very useful. So if you go to the Adobe, Salesforce, Microsoft, their annual, MarTech confabs, they're not bad conferences. The problem that we hear from a lot of people is that they're kind of more around sort of merchandising and cross-selling and a little bit less about business best practices. And it's unfortunate that these sorts of events have crowded out some of the other conferences that are out there in the world, where you could get more kind of independent, non-vendor specific information. But the bottom line is, look, you're the buyer. You don't have to be bullied here. You can definitely use the sorts of charts like I had on the previous slide to really justify why you're making an independent choice. Or for that matter, prove that your incumbent vendor is a good choice. They just have to prove it to you, ideally through a bake-off. Okay, so some key takeaways, and I'll remind you that we've got time for questions here. So first, you knew this already, it's nothing new, but major MarTech and CX vendors will aggressively cross-sell you, often against your own interests. So you have to have caveat emptor here and really defend your interests. Their offerings are never, ever, ever stack in the box, right? They have a somewhat discombobulated set of offerings, which typically it's not a good R&D play for them in terms of integrating them very much. They tend to integrate them on the surface and not really underneath. That becomes your job. Their desire for sort of the share of stack metric can lead to overselling. And by the way, it's a high risk for you to be putting a lot of your eggs in one basket as well. So their high metrics on share of stack can be kind of negative KPIs for you. There are benefits to vendor incumbency. I'm not saying that there aren't, but they are relative and not absolute. So you need to find a structured way of comparing them against the disadvantages that that particular vendor might bring to a new platform. All this is to say, for number 5, take internal responsibility for stack decision-making. You can outsource many things in the MarTech world, but you should never, ever, ever outsource MarTech stack decision-making. You should be the owner of your stack and recognize it's going to be a multi-layered omni-channel stack, and therefore separations of concerns are very important for you. As you make new decisions about that stack, or as you select new technologies, number 6, you definitely want to apply design thinking to technology solutions if you want solutions that will really work. This inevitably involves user stories. A lot more to say about that. You can see many recording webinars on our site to get into the details around that. Then you will still have key anchor tenants. So you may still have important relationships with Salesforce, Adobe, Acoustic, Oracle for major platforms in your environment. That's not a bad thing because they are good at certain things, but they're not the whole mall, and they should never be the whole mall. Too risky for you. So another way of putting this is fall in love with your customer, not your vendors, and then build accordingly. So in summary, don't be this guy. Now, Salesforce may be an important relationship with you, but the goal is not to advance Salesforce. The goal here is to create a more coherent, more effective customer experience. And that may mean sometimes not deploying certain tools from Salesforce, probably even more often than not. So as you think about your questions, feel free to pose them in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll get to those. In the meantime, Scott, you can talk about next steps and how these individuals might engage with us going forward.
Great, thanks, Tony. And as Tony mentioned, feel free to ask questions in the GoToWebinar control panel in the questions tab. In the meantime, you're certainly encouraged to take a look at any of the different research excerpts from our website that may apply to you. So you're welcome to download sample chapters from each of the research areas we cover. We're also more than happy to take you on a behind-the-scenes tour of the Real Story Group subscriber experience and get an idea of what exactly would be available to you if you were to work with us. For those who are subscribers, especially those that subscribe to our web content management research, we will be actually having a exclusive subscriber-only webinar next Wednesday, which will be our no BS look at the 2020 web content management marketplace. So certainly encourage those that are WCM subscribers to sign up for that. And if you're thinking about a subscription, that's one of the benefits to look forward to is those subscriber-only webinars. In the meantime, it does look like we have a couple questions trickling in. So Tony, I'll send it back to you.
Yeah, so Aaron is asking, make sure that I understood, this is Aaron asking, the gist is not necessarily to quote unquote check the boxes of promise features, but one, assure that the promise feature actually works well on its own, and two, assure that the promise feature works well in the context of your tech stack and culture practices. That's exactly true. The only thing I would modify there, Aaron, is assure that the promise feature actually works well, you know, in your context. Like define what does work well mean for me. And so that's tricky because two systems might take a very different approach, and I'm not going to say that one's better than the other. Like two may take a very different approach to workflow, for example, but one is going to be a better fit for you. So the key thing is really around fitness to your purposes, and the best way to test that is by developing narrative user stories. And then absolutely assure that it works well in the context of your tech stack, your broader culture and practices. Is this going to be an overlapping service? How does it fit in the bigger picture? So really good question, Aaron. Greg is asking, if the best practice is to incorporate solutions that are purpose fit, what kind of integration methodology do you recommend to blend these with incumbent stacks, and what challenges might I face with this approach? So the first thing I would say about Greg is that you're going to face integration challenges no matter what. If I go back to that slide where you had, 40 boxes and Salesforce was going to try to fill in 32 of them, you're still going to have massive integration issues just in an all Salesforce environment. So it's a question that doesn't necessarily relate to which vendor you're working with. And I think a lot of people fear taking a more best of breed approach because it's going to bring more integration challenges. In my experience, integration challenges are going to find you anyway. So, the first thing is to really understand, take a services perspective and not always a platform perspective. Like what services are going to reside where, and to have a lot of enterprise architectural clarity around that. But then the second thing is to really develop solid integration use cases. I think sometimes we kind of over-integrate and under-integrate. In other words, we over-index on it by saying, oh, we've got all these things that have to integrate across all these different areas. And the reality is your business use cases should also drive your integration use cases and then work from there. I think one of the benefits of this approach to the stack that we're suggesting, where you have these enterprise foundation layers that live beneath your stack, is that in a sense that becomes your integration space. That you have a common CDP platform, so it's a one-to-many integration rather than many-to-many. You have a common decisioning layer, so that becomes a one-to-many integration and not many-to-many. So I would say that architecturally, to the extent that you can cut down on many-to-many and start doing more one-to-many integrations, you're in a much easier place. And then obviously APIs and other things are your friend. Soren is asking, do you see the high pressure to innovate in customer experience favors best of breed and agility versus big vendor suites? Well, it's tough to say. I mean, we've always argued that, on our subway map, you have the city center and then you have this periphery of all these different vendors. And most innovation, Soren, typically has happened in the periphery. And that's why big vendors sometimes acquire small vendors to take advantage of the innovation that they've been able to, establish and nourish. This is not to say that vendors aren't innovating. Certainly Adobe and Salesforce, to a lesser extent Acoustic and Microsoft and others, are innovating on their own platforms, bringing in new tools, sometimes creating new tools. And so there's innovation happening. It's just that some of the more agility, I would say, is certainly happening more in the periphery, rather than at the center. So. Great, we've reached the bottom of our half hour. We would love to talk more about this. We're certainly talking about this a lot in the council that Scott mentioned, this private peer group council. We're having a lot of conversations around this exact issue, where to leverage your existing relationships and where to put boundaries around them. So we're looking forward to kind of continuing that discussion with them next week. And this is also increasingly an issue in our research as well, where we're kind of grounding our vendor evaluations in kind of broader stack fit, which is a really interesting exercise, I think, for us and also for you as a potential customer of our research. So on behalf of Scott Dill, wanted to thank you again for joining in with us and wish you a very good rest of your week. Until next time, this is Tony Byrne signing out for Real Story Group. Bye now.